There's always this sort of trial. We're very fast to do things. We see if it works, we follow, we drop stuff if it doesn't work. That experimental phase, or that sort of entrepreneurial experimentation, I think has been really in the DNA. Even today, I still think we trial stuff. Even if you think about AI, we trial stuff very quickly. We see if it works. We're quite happy to make some errors. It's just kind of really in the culture.
Entrepreneurialism, innovation, definitely is the DNA that I think still kind of goes through us. And of course, as you get bigger, there's a risk you lose some of that. So you have to kind of really refocus and kind of concentrate on it.
Could you tell Matthew your first impressions of him when you first met? What were your first impressions of Matthew?
Very good-looking guy.
If you can
from
remember
Apax.
that
So we find ourselves in a restaurant at 11 a.m. in the morning, talking about our kind of 25th kind of anniversary, and we've not even been provided with any decent drinks. Do you want to start off with kind of like how you think about kind of like what's happened to the firm over that period of time?
I'll start by saying it's probably the worst 25th birthday party I think I've ever been to in my life. So far.
Two of us had 2 glasses of water.
Yeah, exactly. It gets better from here. Well, look, I joined part in the journey, right? I mean, I came after 10 years, so I still feel like a bit like the new boy in town, if I'm completely honest with you. Look, I mean, it's transformational, right? I mean, even for the version I saw, which was probably 50 people in a room in London, largely, it's a very small operation in Munich when I joined. I mean, you just think about not just the scale of the organisation, but just the reach and the number of companies we built and the people we employ more broadly and the clients we serve. I mean, it's just been an extraordinary run, just in terms of the sort of level we've reached now, as we sort of come out of our teenage years and we start to become semi-mature.
Yeah. So what were your initial impressions? Because, we were chatting for a couple of years at least before you joined, and we needed to kind of find something that was like meaningful to grab you out of Apax, which at the time, of course, was a much bigger, much more storied, much more kind of prestigious firm. So, like, in a lot of ways, you were coming from a firm that was already hitting kind of like, I guess, $10 billion fund or something at the time.
11 million euro, yeah.
Coming to this kind of like scrappy place that was probably managing, a couple of billion at the time. And genuinely, like, you must have been like, what am I thinking of doing here at the time?
I think I told you a story once, which is I was going backwards and forwards talking to you and a few others, and I sat in my room in an office in England in the summer of 2010 with the pros and the minuses. Like, why should I do this? Why should I not do this? And it kind of wasn't very easy to make a decision. And ultimately, you just have to trust your gut. I did it for 2 weeks, literally trying to work out what the right trade-off was. And I, in the end, decided you have to trust your gut, right? And the gut was, if I really boiled it down, it was like, if you don't do something like this now, you're never going to have a go at something entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
And my father had been an entrepreneur and I had a family and whatever. And I just thought, I'm at that age, my kids were probably 3 and 5, so it's a little bit reckless from that perspective, if I'm completely honest with you. Don't tell my wife. But it was just like, you're never going to get a shot similar to this very easily. So it's very uncertain, right? It's very hard to codify this is going to work. It's very hard to codify exactly what you're getting into. And then I remember there was a second phase in 2012, the end of 2012. We've been going for 2 years.
I was going to ask you about that.
It was basically a disaster, is the honest answer. Like, it was all going wrong. And I thought, have I just made a terrible decision, right? Is this just the wrong thing? And I remember coming back and talking to you probably in that January, February of 2013. And we said, look, it's close. And it was a refinement thing. It was just a tweak and a tweak and a tweak to get us to a point where it might work. And I think that's quite characteristic of the business, right? There's always this sort of trial. We're very fast to do things. We sort of see if it works, we follow, we drop stuff if it doesn't work. That experimental phase, or that sort of entrepreneurial experimentation, I think has been really in the DNA. Even today, I still think we trial stuff. Even if you think about AI, we trial stuff very quickly. We see if it works. We're quite happy to kind of make some errors. It's just kind of really in the culture.
That's exactly, as you were saying, that decision that you made when you were making the very first appraisal of like pros and cons and stuff, like entrepreneurialism, kind of innovation, definitely kind of is the like DNA that I think still kind of goes through us. And of course, as you get bigger, there's a risk you lose some of that. So you have to kind of really refocus and kind of concentrate on it. If you look at kind of like how you and I and, Batch and Justin and Alan kind of work together, quite different people, quite different skill sets. Trying to describe that to kind of like clients where you kind of go, well, Matthew's CEO, he kind of does 2/3 of a normal CEO role, and then 1/3 is like nothing like a normal CEO role, because by the way, he's CIO as well. And, as chair, I'm supposed to probably go to Davos or something like that, but I couldn't stand the thought of it. So I'd never go and do that stuff, and we kind of mix and match together, kind of almost like organically pick the things that suit us without it being very explicit about how we do that. So I think we're prepared to quite quickly say when we think we've made mistakes or things just aren't going to work, not necessarily the individual's fault. But then when we get to a team that starts to gel, often you've got quite different characters, and it's the kind of combination of those. It's like a sports analogy, isn't it? You need a goalkeeper and a defender and a midfielder and an attacker. You don't ask a striker to play in goal and vice versa, but you need all those skills.
Yeah. The other thing I think we've done over the years a lot is essentially ask our investors, our customers, to trust us on that, to work it out, because they're very used to the idea of I've got a series of investors and I want the number one investor doing this and I want the number two investor doing this, and we sort of said, no, look, it's a bit more of a mishmash game. It's a bit of a team game, and we're going to have to move people to different positions. And just because we had a good run doesn't mean we're not going to slightly rebuild the team a bit. And and I think we've got a lot of confidence now with investors, but it's taken a while for them to feel
Mercury's probably another good example. If you think about what you and David did to kind of re-inject kind of energy and that kind of stuff in that team, probably 3 years ago with Benedict and Louis and Chris and now Farouk and other kind of people coming through. It's been a real next gen succession kind of change, but it's going to happen fairly kind of organically. But I know it took a lot of effort from you and David to kind of make that happen, really.
Yeah. It's always about that team dynamic and trying to play for the next season, right? It's that classic. You win not that we won the league, but you win the league, and then the day after you start planning to win the league the next season, right? It's a different team potentially that's going to have to deliver.
Yeah, I always remember actually because talking back to you joining Mercury, I always remember actually I got these kind of questions at the time that were you what? So for your small cap fund, you've chosen a guy who did media and some consumer for one of the largest cap funds in Europe. How does that possibly work? And you're going to take investors through that. We're recruiting for capability. If we're recruiting for, have you done 7 software buyouts? Frankly, the universe of those people in Europe at the time was almost zero anyway. So there was a nil set. You couldn't get anybody at all. So you had to recruit for not that just immediate, have you got 3 of those on your CV, but actually, can you build? Can you kind of innovate? Can you be entrepreneurial? Because just trying to get somebody who'd done it a few times before really wasn't available. So that, that was hard to explain. And I remember Saturn in reverse, I remember clients on Saturn 1 kind of committing the money and then almost turning around to me and going, just to be clear, you actually don't seem to have a team at all. Don't worry about that.
Don't look too close.
Don't worry about that. We'll sort all that out in due course.
How do you think about that 07, 06, 07 period? You came on, you've been in the firm a little while, but you're now taking over the leadership role. I remember you were trying to bring in a bit of fresh blood, at least that's how you articulated to me back in 08 or whatever it was. What was your vision at the point, or what were you trying to achieve at that point, and how did that then come to play through?
To be honest, I had absolute and complete total clarity that we should just do software or something very close to it. So that part of the kind of strategic, it seemed to be a bit of a no-brainer. We were already probably number 1 in Europe, even though we were relatively small. Software was a growing sector. We could look at what was happening in the US, with firms like Silver Lake and Francisco and the Toma or Vista, all of which we knew because we were, doing our homework and going over and chatting to them and all that kind of stuff. And so it just seemed to me to be a kind of a no-brainer. My problem was quite a lot of things seemed to me to be a no-brainer, but my ability to kind of convince colleagues and other people that had vested careers in other sectors or doing other things just wasn't there. And I still don't think that's a forte for me even now. So for me, I would just kind of classic engineer. I would present the facts, and as far as I was concerned, everybody would just tick it off, and we'd just be moving in that direction. And it took me a long time. Some would say I've never achieved it, to get to work out that you've actually got to bring the bulk of people with you, and some people will move quite fast because they're quite entrepreneurial. Some people will move very, very slow, and actually it's about that middle group. If you want to use a normal distribution, it's about that middle group of people, and you've got to get 40-50% of people for whom this is not a natural thing to cancel 4 sectors and move to 1. You've got to bring them with you over time. So I think that took longer I had pretty clear conviction that this is what we should do, and turned out to be kind of luckily right. But actually just bring the people with you and bringing enough of them with you, you didn't blow the firm up, and you couldn't afford to kind of suddenly lose 4 or 5 or 6 like really valuable deal doing people that understood kind of how to run portfolio companies and understood clients and all those kind of things. So that's the biggest change we had to kind of put through, is kind of like a change management process for a lot of people who had vested careers and had done a decent job in other sectors and all those kind of things. So trying to handle that was the biggest risk, to be honest with you. I mean, the most difficult thing in a lot of ways was almost me having to kind of overcome this. To me, it was just completely obvious we should do this. But like just standing there in front of people and just saying this is completely obvious, don't you get the logic? Turned out that isn't a great way for persuading most people. So you then have to kind of employ that full range of techniques of kind of persuasion and all those kind of things. I mean, frankly, with you, it was really relatively easy because you tend to think in relatively kind of similar ways, and you went away and did a whole bunch of data and analysis, which I'd not bothered doing. I remember you going away for about 2 or 3 months to kind of actually prove it with real numbers, whereas I didn't need those. I just needed kind of like belief. The more difficult thing is with kind of people who kind of like almost don't want to go through that logical kind of, like I remember, I don't know if you remember, we had one particular sector team where I remember distinctly this kind of sector team that was not software, arguing that they were like number 1 or number 2 in the European market. And I remember literally when this business plan got presented in 08 or 09 or whatever, I remember like thinking, like, on what basis have you done that? Because it's definitely not investments made, it's definitely not returns, it's definitely not lack of volatility. It's like on anything objective, we're not even in top 4 or 5. That's what I found the most difficult, was kind of like getting people who were capable but like didn't think through that like logical, analytical kind of way for how you think about a strategy. That was super tough.
I mean, I remember, so when I came in, obviously end of 10, start of 11, and we still had, there was a renewables fund running. There was obviously all the stuff in Germany. There was still the tail end of the consumer stuff going. Healthcare was still, like healthcare as in like facilities and stuff like that. Yeah. So it was probably another 5 years, probably 14, 15 before like it finally became like we're going all chips in, right? I mean, there was obviously very concentrated already, but it was like there's no way back. Like we're burning the boat now. This is it. And that to me felt at the time when this was really, really going to get momentum, because all the effort in the organisation and all the energy of the people and just a commitment of like this is going to go now felt universal, right? There was just no way back. And that was I think about it in terms of some of the companies we back, right? Some of the early stage stuff with the Mercury or whatever, but it's at some point you do actually have to burn a boat, right? It's the money, it's your career, it's whatever it is, but you'll have to decide you're in. It makes such a difference to the momentum you then deploy and how committed you are and how much focus you put on something.
It's a bit like these conversations we have with companies where we kind of go like, what's your ICP? What's your ideal customer profile? And, you get some people that are incredibly laser focused. They're generally the better performers. And then you get some people for whom, well, I kind of like to dabble a bit in this other area as well. And, actually there's this other area that's like slightly bespoking for large customers. And they can't really describe what they're spending most of their time on. And I think it was the same. We got to 70, 80% what we wanted to do. But that long tail of, as you say, the end of consumer and a little bit of healthcare that we were still doing in 2011, 2012, it took a long time to kind of like clear that last 10 or 20% out, and it's actually incredibly distracting. You spend a third of your time managing what is basically kind of 10 or 20% by number, but probably 5 or 10% by value. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, you should just cut all that off 3 or 4 years earlier. But hindsight's a wonderful thing.
I mean, you and I chatted before, but this whole idea of, if you've got single focus on something, right, which is going to be the best as we possibly can, certainly the best in Europe, but maybe the best in the world at some point in terms of how we do software, and you're just singularly focused on that one target, you've got a much obviously higher chance of success. Whereas the vast majority of other people in the investment business or in the private equity industry are sort of, well, we'll hedge and we'll do a bit of this and we'll do a bit of that and we'll think about these deals and so on. I mean, it's just been transformational, right? In terms of just our willingness to go, look, it's going to be here. We're just going to have to be very good at this. And everything else is peripheral, like it's gone. It's just, it's only this now.
Yeah. I think it's even true within software, because, we obviously get labeled as pure software. But the reality is, you look at the entire software universe, We don't do infrastructure software, which is 30 to 40% of our market. And I think it's a very, very good choice for who we were and where we were. Maybe if we were like West Coast originated, it would be slightly different. But I think, first of all, there's less infra in Europe, so we're not naturally suited to it. I also do think it's a slightly different dynamic. Those businesses are more about an annual hits-driven business. And if you're going to keep up with cyber protocols, whatever, you might have a great business going forward. You probably have higher volatility. It's more of a 5X's or zeros kind of business than our vertical app, clearly kind of focused in certain verticals businesses. So even within software as a broad church, I think we focused down on the things that we were not completely uniquely, but very, very well suited to doing best. And we've been prepared to kind of not stretch ourselves into kind of other things that, we could have easily done an occasional deal and made money on. I'm not sure it would have built a 20, 30, 40 investment recurring kind of pipeline. So we talked quite a bit about how we moved from being a kind of 50% software firm to being a kind of 100% software firm, I guess 2010, 11, 12. Obviously the launch of Mercury and that being a kind of absolutely kind of world leading kind of product, which I think really kind of put us on the map there as well. Saturn obviously kind of came later as we built out the kind of full stack in 2017. So we had, small to medium to large kind of investment capability in that focus area. But the other kind of major change, I guess, over that period of time was, go back to kind of 2005, 2010, 2014, 15, we're a purely domestic European investor, taking our business to the US quite a lot to grow, but we've not done kind of platform deals or de novo deals kind of in the US. So clearly that all changed around about 2015. How do you think through how we did that, where we are now and where we're going in the US?
Well, I guess first thing to say is the sort of library of businesses that have come from Europe to the US has worked in either software or financial investment, I guess, is long. There's a long list of failures, right? So There's a very deliberate, how do you not stub your toe? How do you do your best to try and make this work? So
I think it's 90% failure rate. I think Europe to the US is a 90% failure rate, either via organically or via acquisition in general for businesses.
Yeah. So I think there's two things that I think about really, which is we were very deliberate around sort of doing it step by step. We weren't going to try to do some big launch. It started with 14, 15, right? A platform or two, kind of find out what you think you can invest in, leverage existing home kind of IP, who are we dealing with, what kind of people are existing in the market, where does our calling card potentially fit? And that, I think, states from that 14, 15, just one or two deals. You then get do we put some infrastructure down? Do we properly sort of start to ramp up, which is 18, 19, we had COVID obviously come in the middle. And it's probably a third phase of trying that and then saying, okay, what's working, what's not working? And how do we, again, take some active decisions to kind of back the stuff that's working and then kind of backfill or improve and so on. So from 21, 22, again, we did another, pretty meaningful rebuild of, leadership, team, some of the investment activity. And so I feel like now in 25, this thing's running well. It's a meaningful part of our portfolio. The quality of the businesses we're backing, the quality of entrepreneurs we're talking to, the networks we have are very substantial.
Agree.
But that's 10 years of work.
Yep.
So it's a bit like, when somebody wins Wimbledon, they're there's some young thing, where did this come from? It's it was the last 10 years of work that got me here. But also it's it's just, I think, reflection all the time. What could you improve on? How do you get better? How do you take some of the more difficult decisions around people or setup or organization? And that sort of experimentation is just, I think, been crucial.
To me, there's something, again, that runs a little bit in the DNA, which is that kind of, I think it would have been really easy for us to decide to put, 2 or 3 people in New York in 2014, 2015, 2016, when we were doing Sovos and, Mitratech, and a couple of our portfolio companies were doing meaningful M&A, etc. And we almost felt like we kind of purposely kind of held off until the point where we were prepared to kind of burn the boats and, put 30 people in New York and then put 20, 30 people in kind of San Francisco. And, at that point you are completely all in, and hopefully there's no doubt externally or internally that this is going to be a major part of our business and it's going to be very successful, even if it takes us 5 years, 7 years, 10 years to kind of get there. It's that kind of undeniable conviction that we will be successful, but it might take us time because great things take time to build.
So with the scale in the US, obviously a number of platform shifts over the years as we were, technology shifts, I suppose, that underpin up. How do you think about the AI generation? What's the next generation of software companies or next generation of technology companies perhaps that are going to get built? And how do you think about that maturing?
Well, I think it's the most interesting pivot point for the fundamentals of our market that we've seen, frankly, in most of our existence in the last kind of 20 odd years. Obviously, you went mainframe, client server, kind of web. And, this is the next major kind of platform shift. And I think it's going to be a little bit like the kind of SaaS transition, which arguably we've done very, very well from. I think if we get this right, it'll give us another market expansion opportunity, another TAM expansion for our companies to kind of go for. I think the kind of fundamental kind of like thinking and DNA that kind of underpins how we're, I think, pretty well positioned for that is about this kind of like different levels of kind of value creation within software. So, we talked through this at the kind of last client AGM in November. I almost think if you're going to put on a timeline, you've got almost 3 generations of value creation, from left to right in kind of software. You've got software 1.0, which is essentially recognize that B2B software is sticky, buy a B2B software business, whack the costs out, put the margins up. That's really kind of frankly, one of our famous competitors kind of like go-to playbook and probably still is. But that's really the kind of 2010s kind of period, I think, value creation. I think in the last kind of decade, 2015 till now, for the more sophisticated investors in our market, it's been largely about kind of go-to-market kind of value creation playbook. And at the most, basic end, that's, again, sticky software business, whack prices up. It's a pretty much kind of simple lever. At the more sophisticated end, the right-hand end of that, I think it's, very sophisticated. How do you improve the magic number, capacity planning, kind of sales training, sales enablement, customer success, all those things that we know we can try and kind of work really hard on in our portfolio. The problem with both of those, cost cutting 1.0, go-to-market 2.0 is they're both finite. You essentially can do them, if it's cost cutting, it's literally a one-off. If it's go-to-market, you can probably make it effective over 2, 3, 4 years. But at some point, you can't squeeze more juice out of the lemon because you're trying to basically squeeze more juice out of a single thing. So I think 3.0, which is where we've obviously been trying to go over the last kind of like decade, and I think is actually inherent to kind of the HG DNA, we're engineers, quite a lot of us by background, or startups, or a combination of both. If you're looking at kind of Justin and Alan, engineers, a few me and you, etc. I think it's all about product-led innovation. It's all about basically, can you take a business that's got decent products when we buy it and be very clear about that in DD? But then can you actually innovate on that product? Can you have engineering that is actually generating new value for your customers and therefore providing you with a kind of growth engine that can go on for decades? And, the obvious analogy is, one of these, if Apple was still selling this very, very well packaged thing, but it was called an iPhone 10 and it had the features of 6, 7 years ago, none of us would buy it, assuming we wouldn't pay a premium price. It's because they've innovated every year. That, to me, is the best illustration of what I think when we're at our absolute best. I think we do that better than anybody else globally because I think we kind of focus on it more than anybody else globally. To me, that's the future for us as a firm. And it very, very naturally leads into what that means for AI and what we're doing in AI. So I'm almost going to pass the ball back and go. I know you've spent a lot of time on this, obviously, Seb and Amber and Chris and a bunch of other colleagues are as well. I think it's fantastic that we've got the most senior person in the business leading on what is probably the next 10 to 20 year paradigm shift in our industry. So I know you've done an enormous amount of reading. You probably had 3 podcasts last night you were listening to. How do you think about how that's going to affect what we do, how we do it, our portfolio companies, our new investments?
Undoubtedly, it's the biggest platform shift that we've seen probably since the 70s, right? Since the PC really took off. Maybe you could ask the internet was, in terms of communication and distribution, fundamentally changed things, but this is also, or maybe on a similar level to the internet. So however you want to categorize it. I think the big picture frame I take from it is sort of the investment judgment stuff of what we do is because it's always been important, but it's going to become relatively less important. Still important, but relatively it's going to be so much more around how can these businesses develop products, build product, how can we augment that process during the investment period? And so we almost end up needing a capability of, how do we segment a market? How do we think about, the customer proposition? How do we think about the product that serves? How can we re-engineer that product? And how can we use, the most modern AI tools to basically run that through and make that effective and then get it into customers' hands? And if you went back, well, probably now in most software companies, that's still a, 3 to 5 year job. It's 50 million. It's a big old endeavor, and it's a success rate of maybe 50%. Quite rapidly, we're getting to a point where if you're equipped and you've got resources and you've got people and you've got expertise in your particular part of the market, because I do think the last mile is, where the customers really sit is important. That actually becomes something you can probably do in 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
Maybe less, maybe 3 months, right? You can wireframe a prototype product now in a matter of hours, probably. You can get it into prototype within 10 or 12 weeks. You can get into market in 3 months because we've done it in our portfolio. Yeah. We've seen it multiple times now, and customers are buying it within 4 months. And that's real money, right? That's real proof of concept. That's people actually saying, I'm going to write you a check, the proverbial check to take something. So I can see that becoming more and more prevalent in terms of, a part of our business is still the investment piece. How do we source investments? How do we calibrate? How do we judge them? How do we make those decisions? And you've got this big piece of the business over here that says, all right, how do I serve that customer set? That's the end customer of my business. What should they be buying from me? And how do I augment my companies with that capability?
Yeah.
And I think we've only trialed that a year. We started basically a year ago saying, how do we put this into the companies? We've now done it, at least 8 or 10 times. It looks like it's really working. Now it's a question of how do you scale it? Because it's an operational question of scale. But that feels to me like a really important horizon. I guess the final piece of that is then, as per SaaS, if you think about when SaaS was adopted versus on-prem software and what that meant to commercial execution and customer support and all the infrastructure that sat around the business, all the rest of the stuff has to evolve.
Yeah.
So when you think about AI pricing models, when you think about, customer support in that kind of context, when you think about all those, innovation, how do these businesses sort of think about their own customer groups? Because at the moment it's a bit of an uncharted territory, right? There's so much potential that everybody's chasing everything.
Yeah. And it's been a kind of customer pull model to a decent extent as well. So kind of GTM models haven't matured. Customer support hasn't yet matured because most of these businesses have not had more than a year of revenue.
Yes. Yeah. So it's right, when you hear these sort of almost apocryphal stories of, some startup that's now 200 million of ARR and there's only 15 people in the business and so on. And for certain horizontal categories, you can see that. But when you start going into our world of application, I suspect it's more complex and there'll be more people and there'll be more staff and there'll be more ways in which people adopt. But again, if we we are building, frankly, the sort of the DNA and the IP and the pattern recognition of what does that actually take, I think it puts you in a very strong position.
Yeah.
And that to me is the kind of, at least for the next few years, as you start thinking about how AI goes from, West Coast models, mass capability, consumer adoption, which is sort of the phase we're in at the moment, to, all right, how does this really get into the workplace? What do people do with it? How productive is that? You're seeing some very early signs of that really ramping. We were talking about the Harvey fundraise earlier on, literally today. That's a Series E, the very significant sort of signal of where that's going. But that's the next stage.
Yeah. I mean, to me, there's this kind of like huge kind of like singular change, which is for really the history of the world, but, certainly the last 20, 30 years, software development has been, the critical pinch point where essentially it was more expensive and it was the scarcest resource. And so the number one constraint was essentially, how can I get more high quality software developers? How can I make them kind of more efficient? But ultimately that's my constraint on releasing product to the kind of customer. What we've potentially got, we don't know yet if it's kind of like to a very, very, very high degree, or whether it's, somewhere at the curve is software development probably is going to get cheaper with the likes of Devon and these kind of tools and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. And so suddenly that constraint on software development capacity probably eases for the first time. And it gets back to this point you're making about whether we want to call it product management or we want to call it something slightly different in this new world. But basically, you've got the capacity to kind of build more frequently for your customer. How are you going to do that? How are you going to up that pace? How are you going to make sure it's stuff they want and not stuff they don't want is a big decision point where essentially you've not had that as a constraint before, but now that's probably your main constraint.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And so I was struck by some of the conversation we had in our senior leader gathering in Lucerne, right, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it's almost that last mile, which is the customer's now presented with an enormous array of potential sort of capability. How do you, as a provider of workflow automation or sort of, job augmentation or whatever your particular part of helping out, lawyers or tax accountants is, how do you codify that, and how do you make that usable, and how do you make it accessible, and how does that work into their workflow? And there's so much value in there. But that's I think where so much of the investment activity we have, existing companies, new companies we invest in, that's where they play in that kind of positioning. That making that available with this sort of incredible technology back end or sort of flow is huge potential.
Just describe this, because we've used this phrase quite a bit. This last mile, what do you mean by that?
It's if I'm I was going to use a lawyer, maybe it's a bad example. If it's not a good example, but other people are doing that. So if I'm an accountant or I'm a tax professional, right? How do I gather information, interpret information, turn that into return, turn that into advice to a customer? How does all that process happen? How much of that can I, I've been in the industry 20 years. What does it mean to use technology to do that? How do I make that accessible? How does it make it relevant to the customer? How do I make them comfortable that I should be giving that advice? Should they trust a machine? Should they trust me doing it? There's an awful lot of qualification of what does that really mean the end consumer is receiving, the end enterprise or the end consumer is receiving. And I think for the last 2 or 3 years with the LLMs coming on, there was this idea of, well, it'll all just get automated. There'll just be machines and they'll sit there and they'll hum and they'll consume electricity and this will all be automated and it will just go. But the reality is, life's a lot more sticky than that, right? People want, comfort that they understand where the data's come from. They want to worry about hallucinations. They want to worry about, exactly how is this going to be interpreted. They want to worry about quality and brand and those sort of things. And I think that's almost the diffusion effect of how do you take the incredible capability of some of those models, just obviously still evolving, and actually make it applicable and usable to people at large, to the general population or whatever. And that to me is still where that's where our sort of our frontier is coming. That's where we have to essentially make our sort of presence felt.
So, in my own mind, just to almost test with you, actually, the way I always kind of think about it, if I think about it in a kind of tax accountant, which is what I spend quite a lot of my time kind of digging into, I kind of almost picture that accountant having a conversation with a farmer. And that farmer has got a very, very unique set. And I pick that because it's one of the most complex kind of tax use cases that exists. I know because really only Iris has managed to build that capability into its software, 10, 20 years ago. But I think it's that nuance of, not just that kind of farmer, but on that field for that acreage, what government subsidy, what government compliance, did that change halfway through the season because there was rainfall or not rainfall? Was there some law in Europe that affected kind of what happens in terms of tax reclaims and all those kind of things? That to me is the kind of, in my own mind, that's the example I think of where, an accountant as an individual, a real life human being is sitting down and doing that. And I think AI is going to enable a lot of that conversation. But that last little bit that we've just illustrated or talked about, I think it is going to be facilitated, but it's ultimately, that's the very, very kind of thin end of the wedge for, that's what that farmer wants to hear about. He doesn't want to hear generically about how I produce some generic accounts for a farm. He wants to get right down to kind of what's happening this season on that field with that subsidy.
So look, I'm struck by 25 sounds like an old age. That doesn't mean you're our age, but 25 years of a firm. You think as a person when you're 25, your whole world is stuff. You've sort of come through the teenage, you sort of learned some things, and you sort of you've got some pattern recognition, but you've still got so much to do. I feel a lot like that. Yeah. There's just so much still that we could be achieving. We've learned some stuff. We're not naive, and we sort of educate ourselves, and I joke before we come through the college years without doing any real damage. But we're now we've grown up a little bit, but we've still got an awful lot of potential. And I think that to me is the excitement of where we are now, which is this sort of foundation has been laid. We've got this incredible sort of shift in the underlying technology part, and there's other parts of our industry also evolving. Sort of that's the scope and that's the opportunity and excitement in front of us.
Yeah, me too. I think 25 years feels like a long time, but actually we've just got to a position where I think we've now frankly got the benefits of scale. We got the benefits of having delivered for clients over kind of 15, 20 years consistently on a strategy that they like. if it was like plateauing and top of the S curve and all those kind of things, it'd be pretty boring, frankly. What AI and frankly technology's been like this all the way through, but what that gives us is, another mountain, another thing to kind of go and climb and try and conquer, but from a point of view where we've got some resources and capabilities that we probably didn't have 10, 15, 20 years ago. So it's incredibly exciting.
But what we should do, I suspect, is say thank you to the people who made it to this birthday party that we're having, right? Which is like, those clients and those investors that backed us, the people who work with us, the ecosystem sits around us. So many people have got us to this sort of semi-mature state.
I think it was completely obvious 15, 20 years ago. They weren't taking any bets at all. No, I mean, there's a lot of people that have made some pretty big bets in their careers, whether it's people who work for us or whether it's clients supporting us or portfolio CEOs, frankly, that kind of had us as a partner when we were not exactly the kind of firm we are today. So yeah, huge amount of thanks, that they've supported us at very critical times on that journey.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to Orbit, the HG podcast. If you'd like to find out more about HG and our work building enduring enterprises, subscribe to our newsletter at hgcapital.com/newsletters.